Imagine this. It's a quiet evening in a suburban neighborhood. A man sits in his living room, glass of whiskey in hand, convinced his darkest secret is buried forever, until there's a knock at the door. He opens it, and standing there is the wife he thought he killed 8 years ago. This isn't a plot twist from a Hollywood thriller. This is real life. This is the chilling, bizarre, and almost unbelievable story of Robert Hensley, a seemingly ordinary man who harbored an extraordinary secret, and Laura Hensley, the woman he believed he had silenced forever, until she returned from the dead to expose the truth. In the world of true crime, we often hear about murderers evading justice, cold cases never solved, and families left with questions that may never be answered. But rarely do we hear a case where the victim herself becomes the key to unlocking the crime, not from beyond the grave, but by showing up at the very doorstep of her would-be killer. This is one of those stories. Robert and Laura's marriage wasn't perfect. Behind closed doors, what looked like a typical relationship was riddled with control, manipulation, and secrets. Neighbors thought they were just another quiet couple. Friends sensed tension but never imagined it could lead to violence. And when Laura disappeared one night in 2017, Robert spun a convincing tale. She left him. Vanished. No trace. With no body and little evidence, the case eventually went cold. But the truth, as always, refused to stay buried. When Laura reappeared 8 years later, alive but forever changed, the community was rocked to its core. How had she survived? Where had she been? And most importantly, what really happened the night she died? Her return didn't just reopen an investigation. It rewrote the entire narrative and shattered Robert's carefully constructed lies. In this documentary, we will delve into the twisted timeline of this case. The toxic marriage, the alleged murder, the mysterious disappearance, and the unbelievable homecoming. We'll explore the psychological grip Robert held over Laura, the painstaking investigation that followed her reappearance, and the legal reckoning that brought everything to light. Through interviews, analysis, and first-hand accounts, we'll try to answer the burning questions. Did Robert really believe he killed her? How did Laura escape her fate? And what does justice look like when the dead come back to confront their killer? This isn't just a story about crime, it's a story about deception, survival, and the resilience of the human spirit. Stay tuned as we unravel the haunting case of the man who buried his wife, and the wife who returned to haunt him. Behind every shocking crime lies a story, a relationship unraveling, choices made in desperation, and often warning signs ignored. In this case, the tale of Robert and Laura Hensley is one that captivated an entire nation, not just because of the crime, but because of the psychological and emotional web woven long before the first lie was told or the first blow struck. Robert Hensley was a man of routine and order. A 42-year-old contractor from the small town of Mill Creek, Indiana, Robert ran a successful construction business, known for his attention to detail and reliability. On the surface, he was respectable, hardworking, and deeply private. He rarely engaged in gossip, avoided social media, and kept his personal life under lock and key. Born and raised in Mill Creek, Robert was the eldest of 3 siblings. His father, Thomas Hensley, was a stern, old-school factory worker who demanded perfection, and his mother, Marlene, a soft-spoken homemaker, often walked on eggshells around her husband. That dynamic shaped Robert's worldview. Discipline was survival. Control meant safety. From an early age, Robert learned to mask his emotions, never revealing too much, never giving others the upper hand. In high school, Robert was quiet but smart, a loner, some classmates said. He graduated without much fanfare and immediately began apprenticing in carpentry. By 25, he'd started his own construction business. Financially stable and meticulous, Robert was the kind of man many saw as dependable, even if a little intense. But beneath that composed exterior, control was everything to Robert. Employees described him as fair but unforgiving of mistakes. Former girlfriends recounted relationships that turned cold when they asserted independence. One woman, speaking anonymously, said, "He didn't yell. He didn't hit. But he made you feel like your entire world revolved around him, and you owed him everything." Laura Mitchell, later Laura Hensley, was Robert's opposite in many ways. Born in Chicago, she was artistic, outgoing, and free-spirited. At 26, she moved to Mill Creek for a fresh start after her mother's death, hoping to find peace in small-town life. Laura had a passion for photography, often seen with a camera slung over her shoulder, capturing moments from nature to local festivals. Laura met Robert at a charity fundraiser in 2005. He was reserved and polite, offering to help fix her leaky roof when he learned she'd just moved into a fixer-upper home. What began as small acts of kindness quickly escalated into a whirlwind romance. Friends were surprised at the speed of their relationship. Within 6 months, Robert proposed, and by the end of the year they were married. At first, Laura appeared happy and secure. She spoke fondly of Robert's protective nature, his dedication to their home, and his ambitions. Yet, gradually, that protection turned into possession. Laura's sister, Emily Mitchell, recalls the early warnings. Laura stopped coming to family events, she said. She said Robert didn't like her driving alone at night. Then she said her phone had to stay on silent at home. Robert didn't want to be disturbed. Friends noticed Laura's social media presence dwindled. She stopped posting her photography, stopped attending local meetups, and declined invitations. When asked, Laura often smiled and dismissed concerns. Robert just wants us to focus on each other, she'd say. But beneath that smile, there was tension in her eyes, a tension that grew more visible over time. In 2013, Laura confided in Emily that Robert monitored her phone and tracked her whereabouts. He just worries, Laura explained. But Emily wasn't convinced. There was a fear in her voice, she later said. It was like she didn't want to believe what was happening. Laura tried to leave Robert in 2015. She arrived at Emily's house with a bruised arm and a packed bag. She stayed for 3 days, during which she spoke of emotional manipulation, threats, and moments of explosive anger. Yet, on the 4th day Robert showed up. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there, silent, and asked Laura to come home. And she did. She told me he promised to change, Emily recalled. She believed him, or at least she wanted to. March 14, 2017, Mill Creek, Indiana. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Laura Hensley vanished without a trace. The last confirmed sighting of her was at 6:42 p.m., leaving the local pharmacy with a bag of over-the-counter cold medicine. She smiled at the cashier, wished her a good night, and stepped into the rain. That would be the final time anyone outside her home would see Laura, for the next 8 years. By 9:15 p.m., her husband, Robert Hensley, placed a calm yet deliberate call to police. His voice steady, he said, "My wife didn't come home. She went out for groceries and hasn't returned. I've checked the usual places, nothing. Something's wrong." When officers arrived at the Hensley residence, they found no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no disturbances. Laura's purse, wallet, and car keys were still in the house. Oddly, her car was untouched in the garage, rain droplets beating on the windshield. Her cold medicine sat unopened on the kitchen counter. Robert claimed he had fallen asleep in his study and awoke around 8:30 p.m. to find Laura missing. His tone was flat, unemotional. He insisted Laura had been acting distant, possibly depressed. "Maybe she left me," he offered, almost as if suggesting the theory before police could. The town was shocked. Laura was not the type to vanish. Her sister, Emily Mitchell, immediately suspected foul play. Laura wouldn't just leave. Not without telling someone. Not without her car. Friends and family began organizing search parties. Flyers went up. Social media campaigns launched. But after weeks of searching, there were no leads, no witnesses, no body. Police brought Robert in for questioning. He was composed and cooperative, answering every question with mechanical precision. His alibi? He had been at home, alone, reading, then sleeping. No one could confirm or refute it. Investigators dug into Robert's past and their marriage. There were no prior domestic violence reports, but Laura's sister provided texts hinting at control and isolation. One message, sent a month before her disappearance, read, "I feel like I can't breathe. He watches everything I do. I'm scared him." Still, without hard evidence, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. What really happened that night? What police didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that Laura's disappearance wasn't voluntary, and Robert hadn't merely let her walk away. Behind the closed doors of the Hensley home, something far more sinister had unfolded. According to Laura's later testimony, that night began like many others, tense and silent. Robert had been agitated, questioning her about a phone call she'd made to her sister earlier that day. He accused her of planning to leave him, of betraying him. The argument escalated. Laura tried to leave, heading toward the front door, but Robert blocked her path. What followed was a violent struggle. Robert, in a fit of rage, struck Laura with a heavy object, believed to be a metal lamp from the living room. She fell, bleeding and unconscious. Believing he had killed her, Robert panicked. But instead of calling for help, he made a cold decision. He would dispose of her body and erase her existence. Robert wrapped Laura in a tarp, drove her, still barely alive, to a remote area outside of town where he had access to a construction site. There, under the cover of darkness, he buried her in a shallow grave, convinced his secret was safe. But fate had other plans. Unbeknownst to Robert, Laura was not dead. The blow had knocked her unconscious, but she came to hours later, buried, suffocating but alive. In a moment that can only be described as miraculous, Laura clawed her way to the surface. Disoriented, injured, and terrified, she stumbled through the woods. A passing truck driver, Miguel Torres, found her collapsed near the roadside, covered in dirt and blood. He called 911. Here's where the story took another twist. Laura, in shock and fearing Robert would hunt her down, refused to reveal her identity. At the hospital, she gave a false name and claimed she had no memory of what happened. Fearing retaliation, she entered a women's shelter in another state under a protection program for domestic abuse survivors. For 8 years, Laura lived in secrecy and fear, watching from afar as Robert lived freely. She wrestled with the trauma, the guilt, the constant fear that he might find her. But over time her strength returned, and with it the desire for justice. In early 2025, Laura made a life-changing decision: to confront her past and expose the man who had tried to kill her. For nearly 8 years, Robert Hensley lived a life built on lies. In the quiet town of Mill Creek, Indiana, he maintained the facade of a grieving husband, quietly enduring sympathetic glances and condolences. His home was somber, his demeanor reserved, and his story never changed. Laura had disappeared and he didn't know why. Behind closed doors, however, Robert was not haunted. He was content. He believed he had gotten away with murder. He had buried his secret in the cold earth and watched as time worked in his favor, dulling the suspicions of others and washing away evidence. He was free. Or so he thought. March 16, 2025. Almost exactly 8 years to the day since Laura had vanished. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Birds chirped outside the modest Hensley residence. Robert, now 50, had just poured his coffee and settled into his favorite armchair by the window. The world outside was still, peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm about to knock at his door. At precisely 9 a.m. there was a firm knock. Robert wasn't expecting anyone. Frowning, he rose and opened the door. And there she stood. Laura Hensley, alive. Her hair was shorter, her frame thinner, but her eyes were unmistakable. Eyes he had seen filled with fear 8 years ago, now filled with resolve. For a moment, time froze. Robert's face turned pale, the mug of coffee slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Laura's voice was calm, but every word was a dagger. You didn't kill me, Robert. I survived. And I'm here to take back my life. Robert stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock and terror. His breath caught in his throat as the weight of reality crashed down upon him. The woman he thought he had buried, the one whose memory he believed he had erased, was now standing in his doorway, a living, breathing witness to his crime. The town reacts. News of Laura's return spread through Mill Creek like wildfire. People were stunned, confused, and frankly disbelieving. Hadn't she been dead? Hadn't Robert mourned her publicly? Now everything was unraveling. Neighbors recalled how Robert had kept to himself over the years, how he had declined interviews, memorials, and community support. He never wanted to talk about her, one neighbor said. Now we know why. Laura's sister, Emily, was the first to confirm it was really her. Tears streaming down her face, Emily embraced her long-lost sister, saying, I knew you were out there. I never stopped believing. The media frenzy was immediate. Reporters camped outside the Hensley home. Helicopters flew overhead. National networks picked up the story. Wife presumed dead returns after 8 years, husband accused of murder. In a tearful but powerful statement, Laura recounted the events of that fateful night, how Robert had attacked her, buried her alive, and left her for dead. She described the terror of waking up in a shallow grave, the fight for her life, and her escape to anonymity. I was afraid, Laura said. Afraid he would find me. Afraid no one would believe me. But I'm done being afraid. For 8 years, Laura had lived under an assumed name, working odd jobs, moving from town to town. She struggled with trauma, nightmares, and isolation. Yet, through therapy and support, she found strength. She realized she could not remain hidden forever. Her return wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming her identity, her life, and exposing the truth Robert fought so hard to bury. Robert's arrest. That same afternoon, police arrived at the Hensley home. Robert was silent, expressionless as he was handcuffed and led away. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Robert said nothing. His carefully constructed world had collapsed in mere hours. Authorities reopened the cold case, this time with a living witness and a detailed account of the attempted murder. Investigators scoured the property where Robert had allegedly buried Laura, uncovering remnants of the tarp, blood traces, and the shallow grave site, corroborating Laura's testimony. In the eyes of the law, Robert Hensley was no longer a grieving husband. He was now the prime suspect in an attempted murder case. For the people of Mill Creek, the return of Laura Hensley forced a painful reckoning. How had they been so deceived? How had Robert, the quiet contractor, fooled everyone? Some blamed themselves for not seeing the signs. Others marveled at Laura's strength and survival, calling her a miracle, a fighter, a symbol of hope for abuse survivors everywhere. The shocking return wasn't just a personal victory for Laura, it became a national story of survival, betrayal, and the ultimate resurgence of truth. Robert Hensley had buried his secret. But secrets have a way of digging themselves out, and knocking at your door when you least expect it. As Laura Hensley's return sent shockwaves through Mill Creek and beyond, law enforcement faced an urgent, high-profile case, one that blurred the line between miracle and nightmare. After 8 years, a woman presumed dead had not only resurfaced but brought with her a story so harrowing and incredible, it demanded immediate action. The moment Laura walked into the Mill Creek Police Department, flanked by her sister Emily and an attorney, the cold case file on her disappearance, sealed for nearly a decade, was abruptly reopened. Detective Jared Collins, who had originally worked the case in 2017, was brought out of semi-retirement to oversee the renewed investigation. His first words upon seeing Laura? "I never thought I'd see the day. Let's get you justice." Over the course of multiple interviews, Laura provided a detailed account of the night Robert tried to kill her, each memory vivid and trauma-laced. She recounted how he struck her with a metal lamp, how she awoke in darkness beneath the earth, and how sheer survival instinct allowed her to claw her way free. Crucially, Laura identified the remote burial site, a half-completed subdivision Robert once worked on. Investigators descended upon the location, accompanied by forensic teams, and began to excavate the area. What they uncovered was damning. Buried under a layer of soil and construction debris, authorities discovered scraps of tarp, a blood-stained shovel and Laura's torn jacket, items long buried, now silent witnesses to Robert's crime. Blood samples were tested and matched Laura's DNA. But that wasn't all. Using advanced ground-penetrating radar, police detected disturbed earth patterns, indicating a shallow grave that had been hastily covered. Even after 8 years, nature had preserved enough evidence to corroborate Laura's story. With the physical evidence in hand, law enforcement formally arrested Robert Hensley. Charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, aggravated assault, and obstruction of justice, Robert was denied bail due to the severity of the crime and the deceptive nature of his behavior over the past 8 years. In court, Robert appeared stoic, but cracks quickly formed. His defense attorney argued insufficient memory of the night in question and claimed that Laura's account was fabricated or exaggerated, alleging mental illness and paranoia. However, prosecutors were unrelenting. They had Laura's testimony, forensic evidence, and motive, control, jealousy, and fear of abandonment. Text messages between Laura and her sister painted a clear picture of a controlling husband on the edge. One message read, "If something happens to me, it's Robert. I want you to know that." The jury listened in stunned silence as Laura took the stand, recounting the night of her assault and the years spent hiding in fear. Her emotional testimony brought many to tears, including court staff. She said, "He thought he could end me. That no one would care, that no one would ask questions. But I survived. And I will not be silenced." Robert's demeanor shifted. The once calm man grew tense, his composure cracking under the weight of evidence. As more witnesses took the stand, neighbors, friends, forensic experts, the case against him became overwhelming. The pivotal moment came when Miguel Torres, the truck driver who found Laura 8 years ago, testified. He recalled finding a disoriented woman covered in dirt, bleeding, terrified. While Laura had initially refused to give her name, Miguel's testimony validated her timeline and survival story. Additionally, phone records from 2017 revealed suspicious gaps in Robert's call log the night of Laura's disappearance. GPS data placed his phone near the burial site, despite his claim that he'd never left the house. Robert's web of lies unraveled. After weeks of intense trial proceedings, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge, in a powerful statement, said, "Mr. Hensley, you buried your wife and believed your crime would remain hidden. But the truth clawed its way to the surface, literally and figuratively. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars." Legal fallout. Robert was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, his name forever linked to one of the most shocking cases of domestic violence and attempted murder in Indiana's history. But the fallout extended beyond prison bars. Robert's business collapsed, his reputation destroyed. Friends and community members who once supported him turned away in disgust. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies began reviewing cold cases, inspired by Laura's survival and the failure of the system to detect Robert's deception earlier. In a final twist, Laura filed a civil suit against Robert, seeking damages for trauma, loss of livelihood, and emotional distress. The court awarded her a 7-figure settlement, taken from Robert's remaining assets. But for Laura, no amount of money could ever erase the pain. Her true victory was freedom and justice. The guilty verdict against Robert Hensley sent ripples far beyond the courtroom. For many, it marked the end of a dark chapter in Mill Creek's history, but for Laura Hensley, it was only the beginning of healing, a long and complicated journey shaped by survival, trauma, and the fight for identity. After the trial, Laura stepped into the public eye not as a victim, but as a survivor. She became an advocate for domestic abuse survivors, sharing her story on national platforms, including interviews on 60 Minutes, Good Morning America, and a feature in People magazine titled, Buried Alive, The Woman Who Refused to Die. Her voice became a symbol of resilience, inspiring thousands who had endured abuse in silence. She frequently spoke about the emotional toll of living in hiding for 8 years, how every day was a battle with fear, PTSD, and the guilt of survival. I lost 8 years of my life, but I gained something powerful, my voice. And now I'm using it. Laura used part of her civil settlement to establish the Phoenix Foundation, a nonprofit offering resources and support for women escaping abusive relationships, with a special focus on emergency housing and legal aid. Meanwhile, Mill Creek struggled to come to terms with its collective failure. Many residents expressed remorse over having believed Robert's lies, and the local police department conducted a review of the original investigation, examining missed signs and biases that allowed a predator to walk free for nearly a decade. Robert Hensley was now inmate number 58294, serving life without parole at Indiana State Prison. From the moment he entered, he was known not just as a criminal, but as a man who tried to bury the truth and failed. Laura, despite the trauma, found peace in rebuilding her life. She reconnected with family, found solace in therapy, and eventually returned to writing, something she once loved. Her memoir titled The Knock, How I Survived My Own Murder, quickly became a bestseller. She now lives under her own name, no longer in hiding, no longer in fear. Her story is one of survival, justice, and the indomitable human spirit, a chilling reminder that sometimes the dead do return, not as ghosts but as truth that cannot be silenced. In the quiet town of Mill Creek, Robert Hensley thought he had committed the perfect crime. He believed he had silenced his wife forever, buried not only her body but the truth. For 8 years he walked freely, unburdened, living under the illusion that time would erase his sins. But truth doesn't stay buried, and neither did Laura Hensley. Her survival was nothing short of extraordinary. She clawed her way out of the ground, literally and figuratively, fighting through pain, fear, and loneliness. She lost nearly a decade of her life, hiding in the shadows, afraid of being found, afraid of not being believed. Yet in the end, courage triumphed over fear. Laura's return wasn't just a moment of shocking revelation, it was justice resurrected. She walked back into her own life, not as a victim, but as a woman determined to confront her past, face her attacker, and reclaim her future. The man who tried to kill her now sits behind bars, while Laura lives freely, a symbol of resilience in the face of unthinkable horror. This case is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the people closest to us, the ones we trust, can hide the darkest intentions. It shows us how control, manipulation, and violence can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly normal lives. But it also shows us something else, the indestructible power of the human spirit. Laura's story will be remembered not because of what was done to her, but because of what she did next. She refused to remain buried. She refused to let fear define her. And when she knocked on Robert's door that morning, she didn't just confront her past, she shattered it. At Family Crime Exposed, we bring you real stories like these, stories of betrayal, crime, and survival. Because sometimes the most horrifying tales are not fiction, they're family.